What is Terrence Howard talking about? What are you doing, Terry?
What you doing, Terry?
And does 1 times 1 equal 2? That's what a lot of people were talking about at least several weeks ago when Terrence Howard, an actor, went on Joe Rogan's podcast to basically say that all of science is wrong, and he is right. I'm a little late to the party here. A lot of science communicators and even Neil deGrasse Tyson have responded to this episode of the Joe Rogan podcast. But although Terrence Howard said a lot of wacky things like 1 times 1 equals 2, he said them in a way that a lot of people who are susceptible to non-scientific thinking might believe. So I think that they're worth addressing, so let's not waste any time. I'm Dr. Wilson, I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and let's just jump right into this episode. So about the first hour of this podcast is Terrence Howard telling Joe Rogan how he came up with these ideas that he has today. It started like how most great ideas start. He had dreams in the womb that taught him things that he now knows today to be true. Yeah, you heard that first part right. He thinks that he got memories in the womb that taught him scientific things. No, I'm not making this up or trying to make him look bad. That's what he says.
So you felt like that, like from the womb?
From the womb, I had to get this done.
So you felt like you had these things that you didn't get out in a previous lifetime, and now you feel like an unstoppable urge.
I have to at all costs.
So most of these things are having to do with astronomy, cosmology, or physics. Those are not my field. I'm a molecular biologist. I'm not going to be covering them here, but like I said, other science communicators, including Neil deGrasse Tyson, have already talked about a lot of this stuff. So I'll link those below and you can go check those out if you're interested. But what I will mention really quick is that if you listen to Terrence Howard talking about these things for any amount of time, you realize that the words that he's using in his sentences don't actually mean anything when you put them all together. And if you don't know anything about the topic that he's talking about, it can sound good or just sound like gibberish. But either way, you don't necessarily know how true what he's saying is or how to refute it. And that's the point. It's a tactic many people use to fool their audience into thinking they know what they're talking about. And I can say this because when he got to talking about biology, it became glaringly obvious that this is exactly what he is doing. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Now, because we have the angles of incidence, material engineering can now separate the space between carbon and nitrogen or carbon and boron and have the same elements of titanium, vanadium, chromium, magnesium, and iron, or nickel, cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, gallium, or germanium in those higher octaves. We can do that between silicon and phosphorus or silicon and aluminum. So the transparent aluminum now becomes possible because we can now control the pressure and change the pressure and motion conditions where we couldn't do that before because they were going by Cartesian space at 90 degrees and 45 degrees straight lines, the Euclidean space that they've made up, this orthogonal.
Yeah,
What you doing, Terry?
Tell me how a planet is formed under this theory. So you have a sun, and how does the sun give birth to these planets?
The same way we defecate and have gas, like Jupiter's, that red spot on Jupiter, that's spinning on it, that's going to become a moon. It may take a billion or 2 billion years. That will ultimately become a moon off of Jupiter. Where is it? Right at the equator. Where do we discharge it? Right at our equator.
Yeah, I guess. Gravity's not real, and planets are made by suns. Planets are sun poop. Suns literally poop out planets, and that's what the Earth is. I don't know. And then this happened.
Is that your phone?
Yeah, that's my detox thing. I'm supposed to detox right now.
How do you detox? You detox on a timer? What do you do?
Just things to counteract the natural the metals that we have in our bodies that wear us out.
And you just take these periodically throughout the day on a timer?
I got to do it now.
I just think that this is ironic and important context given what we're about to hear them say about other products.
You took a bold stand, though, years ago when the governments were trying to poison their citizens.
Oh, yeah. You know where this is going.
I appreciate you because I lost 3-4 jobs because I refused to take it. I refuse.
I bet you feel better about it now.
Well,
especially when you know all these people that have health problems because of it.
Cancers have increased 300%.
Yeah.
So, okay, there are going to be a lot of stops in this about 10-minute clip I'm trying to play here, but right off the bat, no, there has not been a 300% increase in cancers. That is a complete lie. In fact, if you take the years 2020 through 2023 in the US, the highest rate of cancer deaths was 2020, and it's been going consistently down since then. What I see a lot of people do is misinterpret this study, which is reported in headlines as saying that there's a mysterious increase in cancers in young people. But in reality, the period of time being studied, which people don't go to the actual study title to read, is 1990 through 2019. That's when the increases in cancers in young people occurred. But even then, it wasn't 300%. So I have no clue where he's even getting that from. It's a complete lie. And of course, it just flies right past Joe Rogan.
All-cause mortality up 40% in some age groups.
Next lie coming from Joe here, he's saying that all-cause mortality is up 40% in some age groups. And of course, he's implying that it's COVID vaccines that are causing this. And just no. Since 2020, increases in excess deaths or all-cause mortality have always coincided with waves of COVID deaths. And that's all across the world, across age groups. All of the data implicate COVID in increases in all-cause mortality and excess deaths. But if Joe or Terrence want to think honestly about this and interrogate these questions earnestly, they would ask, have there been any studies comparing vaccinated groups to unvaccinated groups and measuring all-cause mortality? The answer is yes. And all of them show, you guessed it, vaccinated groups have lower rates of all-cause mortality than unvaccinated groups. This remains true even when you take COVID out of the equation and just look at all-cause mortality excluding COVID. It's still true.
Pulmonary embolisms almost up like 500%.
Yeah, I wonder what caused that.
Terrence says pulmonary embolisms or blood clots in the lungs are up 500%. And that's a cute look that he gives Joe Rogan when he asks what caused that, as if it's so obvious. Yeah, it is pretty obvious. It's COVID. Yeah, the biggest increases in lung damage and blood clots caused in the lungs are coinciding with COVID. And again, this 500% number, no idea where he got that. Maybe he got told it in the womb. I don't know, but there's no source for that. There's nothing that backs up that number anywhere. I mean, normally these things are just repeated from some source that's misrepresenting something, but here, I don't know. It's just plain wrong, and he got it from the ether or something.
Well,
Crazy.
the spike proteins that's being built and collected within the system. We can go into. I have a.
While he collects his thoughts there, I just want to point out that if he's claiming that the spike protein is what's causing these things, he should be terrified of SARS-CoV-2, which, when you get infected with that virus, you make a lot more spike protein than you do when you're vaccinated. Just a little bit of thinking goes a long way here. So let's see what he has to say and see if his thinking cap gets any tighter.
I can walk you through what the spike protein did to the BRCA1 gene. That's that gene inside of our DNA that tells us that there's damage that's happening, almost like the crews that go along the highway and they immediately put up cones every time there's a problem.
All right, let's help him out a little bit here. The BRCA1 or BRCA1 gene is one of several genes within your DNA that code for DNA repair proteins. And the analogy he used was, okay, it's basically whenever there's damage in your DNA, these DNA repair proteins will target those damaged regions and try to repair them. And like I said, there are multiple genes within your body that do this. There's not just one. And spike protein does not disrupt it. There was one paper published a while back that claimed that spike protein got into the nucleus and disrupted the BRCA1 gene specifically, but that paper has since been retracted and there's been no evidence since then to suggest a sort of function. And that makes sense because the spike protein is not one that is meant to go in the nucleus. It's just meant to help the SARS-CoV-2 virus bind to and enter your cells. There is no good evidence suggesting that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is going to increase your risk of cancer, and accordingly we have not seen an increase in the rates of cancer in the population. But again, if it did pose that risk, then we would be absolutely worried about getting infected with SARS-CoV-2. It's made up of spike protein, and it makes more spike protein when it gets in your body. That's what it does. So to use this argument to say that vaccines are bad, while not acknowledging the dangers of SARS-CoV-2 is wild. But again, the danger here hasn't shown to be there. The risk with SARS-CoV-2 spike protein causing cancer is not there. But at least I can kind of guess where he got this idea. I mean, that's an improvement, right? Right?
Well, the spike protein, which is no protein has ever been able to enter into the nucleus of a cell.
What is he talking about?
What you doing, Terry?
There are plenty of proteins whose actual job it is to get into the nucleus. Your body makes several proteins that, once they're made outside the nucleus, they need to go back into the nucleus to do their job. There are also viruses that need to enter your nucleus in order to replicate, and those viruses are made of proteins. It's moments like this where you just realize that the person on the podcast that tens of millions of people are listening to just has not taken the time to read basic biology, and yet he's on there talking so confidently about things he has absolutely no clue about. Where is he getting that confidence? I want to know. You can bottle that and sell it. You'd be a millionaire. My God, this is crazy.
Not only does it go to the ribosomes and say, hey, you know what? I don't want you to produce whatever protein, like if it was a skin cell, you're not going to produce keratin anymore. You're just going to produce these spike proteins.
Oh my God. Okay, so let me decode what he's saying here. He's saying that the ribosome, not the ribosome, is making the spike protein. And I guess he thinks that there's only one ribosome in a cell, because he says that once the ribosome is making the spike protein, then that cell can't make keratin. That's the example he gave. No, each one of your cells has millions of ribosomes, up to 10 million ribosomes at any given time. And each ribosome finds an mRNA, uses that mRNA to make a protein, and then once it's done reading that mRNA one time, it detaches from that mRNA and finds a new one. It doesn't get stuck making one protein forever. That's just not how this works. So in the case of mRNA vaccines, a fraction of the ribosomes in the cell are going to find that spike mRNA, make spike protein for a limited amount of time, and then move on to the next job. I'll keep trying to give as much background as I can so you can understand why what he's saying is wrong, but he just keeps saying wrong things, so bear with me.
The cancers are building up. The spike proteins weren't shedding from the body. They collected in the ovaries. They collected in the lymph nodes. They collected in the bone marrow.
Oh, okay, good. So, no, he's wrong there, but I know where he's getting this from now. I recently made a video about this where I take Brett Weinstein to town on this very topic, but no, spike protein does not accumulate in the ovaries following mRNA vaccination. What he's referring to is a study with rats that were injected with mRNA vaccine, equating to several hundred times the amount of mRNA vaccine that we receive in one dose. And then the experimenters measured the lipids and where the lipids go, not the spike protein. And it was found that less than 1% of the total lipid content that was given in the shot went to the ovaries. So a massive dose to a rat, and you get a tiny quantity of the lipids in the ovaries. Meanwhile, there are several studies looking at where expression of the spike protein happens. In other words, what cells take up the mRNA and actually produce spike protein. And it's always in the injection site, the draining lymph nodes, the liver, and the spleen. So yeah, he got something right. He said lymph nodes there. He also then said bone marrow, which is wrong. But these are all places that we would expect any vaccine to go. It goes to the injection site for obvious reasons, the lymph nodes because they are immune organs, and once immune cells take up the contents of the vaccine at an injection site, they will travel to the draining lymph nodes in order to help train immune cells so that you have an immune memory against whatever antigen is present in the vaccine. Same thing for the spleen, it's an immune organ, and the liver because it breaks down a lot of the materials you consume. So if you have four materials that can be broken down for energy, it'll go to the liver, and the liver will break those things down.
And the more boosters you get,
boom,
the
you're
worse
turning your
outcomes are
system
gonna be.
off.
No, sorry, Joe, that is also wrong. Every single study has shown that if you get more boosters, it does not make your outcome worse. For example, I'll have several studies linked in the description showing that when you look at severe outcomes of COVID, individuals with 3 or more vaccine doses continue to have better outcomes than those who have no doses. And if you're more interested in the safety of COVID vaccines rather than whether or not they protect you against COVID, then I'm going to have a lot of papers in the description linked to that as well. I'll also link to a reference manager website that I help curate, which has all of these papers linked in folders that are organized by topic. The analysis always shows that the benefit far outweighs the risk. And these are papers published by independent research groups from all over the world with a variety of different funding sources for their work.
It also showed me the bizarre state of human psychology, that people, if you're presented with what could be a potential solution, you want to believe in it so bad that you're willing to defend these companies that have been the most deceptive companies, proven deceptive, not just deceptive, but deceptive in the way that they are allowed to distribute information.
Well, Joe, the good news is we don't have to just trust the companies, which, by the way, the cases you're thinking about are not them deceiving people. It's them marketing products off-brand, which is highly illegal and earned them some very big fines. But they did not deceive. They did not lie about data. They did not commit fraud. They just marketed their products off-label. But like I said, you don't have to trust the companies. Once this stuff is out there on the market, anybody can study it. And independent research groups, again, from all over the world, have. And so I don't understand this utter hypocrisy, this absolute cognitive dissonance, where Joe seems to live in a world where vaccines that have been studied intensely all over the world and deemed safe and effective by practically every scientific and medical society, every large population study, and every regulatory body, with all of this work spanning countries and ideologies and political landscapes, that's somehow not cool. That's suspicious. But then you get one guy, and I don't care if he's an actor, a certified genius, or has a physics degree, you get one guy who comes in front of you and tells you that suns poop planets, that 1 × 1 = 2, and that he was still in the womb when he was introduced to all these ideas, and you accept it as something that should be taken seriously.
This is not something, like your explanation of these things and your description of the very nature of reality itself is not something that should be taken lightly.
No.
It's something that, like...
Thank you for saying that.
It needs to be laid out, and it needs to be slowly examined.
That is an insane path of thinking. And this guy is the #1 podcaster in the world and makes millions just talking. And this is the stuff that he says. It's crazy. Remember when Joe Rogan used to be sort of reasonable about this?
There's so many wackos out there that think that vaccines are, a scam, or they're dangerous, or there's so many people out there that won't vaccinate their children. You see the measles making a comeback, and directly attributed to a lack of vaccines.
Thank you for what you do say about vaccines, because people listen to you, and we need every positive voice, because we have so many crazy voices out there right now that are so
paranoid and delusional, and they want it all to be a conspiracy.
Yep, those were good times, but now pre-birth dreams are more convincing to Joe. Let's get to what Terrence says about ivermectin.
Ivermectin. Iver means like it caused ivermectin. Mectin, for the Latin of it, it was worms, and it was anti-worms. And what the ivermectin does, it causes the worms to have paralysis, or parasites to have paralysis, because it stops their information from passing. And there's these things called the nodes of Ranvier between each neuron. There's an axon, and there's the axon, and oh my God, I just forgot the leg that comes off of dendrites. Those dendrites and the axons have these things called nodes of Ranvier, where they're not allowed to touch each other, and it transfers potassium and chlorine back and forth to each other. Potassium, chlorine, chloride, and hydrogen back and forth. Well, in the worm, the ivermectin stops that to where the worms become paralyzed.
This is shockingly where he gets the most right. Ivermectin is a neurotoxin to parasites. That is how it kills parasites, and it is a very effective antiparasitic drug. I'm not sure what he thinks that nodes of Ranvier are, but he seems to be imagining them like synapses between axons and dendrites, and that's not what they are. Nodes of Ranvier are located along the axon. And ivermectin actually inhibits glutamate-gated ion channels, which in a parasite is going to, paralyze it. So we got some details wrong, but generally that is how ivermectin works. So surely they must understand that it works on parasites and not viruses, which don't even have neurons. Right?
So it was an immediate defense against the pathogen, but they immediately shut that down and wouldn't allow anybody to use it.
They showed that it stops viral replication.
Completely.
In vitro, yeah.
What mechanism there was described to fight viruses? Viruses don't have neurons. You can't paralyze a virus. What?
What you doing, Terrence?
And yes, Joe is correct that there are some experiments showing that ivermectin can inhibit viral replication in a petri dish. So can bleach. And we don't want to use bleach to treat viruses, right?
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks you out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or?
Okay, well, some people do, but normal people don't. There are tons of substances that can inhibit viral replication in a petri dish, but most of them don't work in the body. In order to get the effects that ivermectin has on a virus in a petri dish in the body, you'd need to take a very unsafe dose of ivermectin to even get close to having that effect. So no, ivermectin is not an antiviral against SARS-CoV-2. It does not work against SARS-CoV-2. It's been tried in several randomized controlled trials, and these randomized controlled trials have tried everything. They've tried different timings of giving the medication. They've tried different doses. They've tried focusing it on specific risk groups. It just doesn't work. But because Joe took ivermectin for his case of COVID, and CNN made fun of him for it, he cannot let it go. He needs to be correct here, or else it'll hurt his alpha brain-fueled ego.
It was confusing to me how many people were willing to go along with it and how many people were angry at people who didn't go along with it regardless of what they were saying. Even if what they were saying was reasonable, even if what they're saying, especially if you're talking about like Jay Bhattacharya and, you know, these people that were professors at esteemed universities and they were being silenced.
Jay Bhattacharya is absolutely someone who we should not have listened to during the COVID pandemic. He was one of the main proponents of the Great Barrington Declaration, which basically said that everybody can go on with normal life except for the vulnerable people who we will protect. Who exactly are the vulnerable people? How exactly are we going to protect them? Don't know, but that's the plan. He basically wanted to just let COVID spread across the population. How letting COVID spread across the population would protect the vulnerable is beyond me. Jay Bhattacharya is also someone who said, and I quote, "On August 1st, 2021, we have protected the vulnerable by vaccinating the older population," quote, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Jay Bhattacharya saying that led Governor Ron DeSantis to loosen COVID precautions and declare that the pandemic was over in Florida. But then the Omicron wave came in 2021 and 2022 and killed at its peak about 200 Floridians a day. Clearly, nobody got everything right during the pandemic, but Jay Bhattacharya is an outstanding example of horribly bad predictions and very misinformed advice. Pretty much all he did was downplay the virus, and he had to downplay it because in the beginning of the pandemic, he said this. If it's true that the novel coronavirus would kill millions without shelter-in-place orders and quarantines, then the extraordinary measures being carried out in cities and states around the country are surely justified. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. COVID would then go on to kill millions of people around the world, and Jay Bhattacharya would never support non-pharmaceutical interventions for preventing the spread of COVID. But Joe thinks he's a swell guy who should have been listened to.
I couldn't understand how black people or people of color were running and trusting the government after what happened to them with the Tuskegee experiment. And for people that don't know what the Tuskegee experiment was, in the early 1920s, a group of government officials came down, doctors, and they went through the black community and they said, there's a sickness in all of you guys and we're going to cure it free of charge. And they injected the black population with syphilis
This is very frustrating to listen to, because the Tuskegee experiments were a horrible, horrible thing and a very, very dark spot in the history of medicine in the United States. They were racist, cruel, and unethical. But Terrence is lying about them. The Tuskegee experiments did not purposely inject black men with syphilis. What they did do is they recruited black men who already had syphilis to a study where they told the black men that they would be treating them for syphilis. Remember, syphilis was absolutely curable at that time, but instead of treating them, they just watched the syphilis symptoms progress in order to study them. This was an abhorrent injustice to the black community, but it is absolutely disrespectful to use it and misrepresent what actually happened in order to push this fear-based agenda that everything the government puts out is going to be poison and evil and we shouldn't take it. I totally understand hearing what actually happened at the Tuskegee experiments and that making you be skeptical of the government. I'm with you there, but we can take it case by case. We can examine each and every situation and look at what the evidence actually says. We can be adults and think critically and not just default to a fear-based system where instead of blindly trusting the government, you blindly trust the contrarian who is against the government. Okay, so that's about all I wanted to address in their 10-minute segment where they just ranted about COVID. But this episode was 3 hours long, and I listened to the whole damn thing, so I might as well go through the rest of it and talk about the other claims about biology that Terrence made, because, yeah, there was more. Because, of course, he thinks he knows what he's talking about in all these other topics, so let's just get to them.
Where's consciousness exist in mankind? Is it in our head, in our body? What's the difference between men or mammals and plant life? Do you think a grain of rice has 54,000 genomes in it? We only have 26,000. Who is more evolved?
Okay, so to put it simply, humans have about 20 to 30,000 genes, and rice plants have about 32,000 to 50,000 genes, so his numbers are a little bit off. But the concept that he's proposing is still wrong. This is a common misconception that I see about evolution. When he asks who is more evolved, that is the wrong question to ask. Evolution is not a process that strives towards perfection. It's something that strives towards good enough. Do you have a horribly flawed body that makes your life very painful, but you can still reproduce before you die? Good enough. Does most of your population live in constant danger of predators, but you still live long enough in greater numbers to reproduce? Good enough. Do the majority of your young die to infectious disease, but you still have enough to continue the species? Good enough. The point is, evolution doesn't care as long as you can pass on your genes. That seems to be what life wants to do, and if there are no selection pressures preventing you from doing that successfully, then evolution is not necessarily going to create a mechanism that helps you deal with those threats. As long as you're well enough adapted to your particular environment to survive and pass on your genes, evolution's okay with that. But how well you're adapted to your environment isn't represented in the number of genes you have, so he's just confused on multiple levels here. For example, bacteria are some of the most successful organisms on the planet, and they have some of the tiniest genomes on the planet.
But what's the difference between us? If you, Jamie, could pull up I have a picture showing hemoglobin and chlorophyll. And you're going to notice that the hemoglobin has the same exact combination of carbon and hydrogen that we have. The only difference they have is the center of theirs is magnesium and the center of ours is iron.
I'm not sure what this has to do with consciousness, but this has to do with porphyrin rings. Porphyrin rings are a very common strategy in biology to bind metals. And he is right that chlorophyll and hemoglobin are very similar in this porphyrin ring structure that binds their respective metals. But there are very subtle differences that allow these porphyrin rings to selectively bind different metals more tightly than other metals. And in this case, evolution, hey, look at that, evolution, is selecting for structures that bind magnesium in plants because that helps chlorophyll do its job more efficiently than other metals. Same with humans and hemoglobin binding iron. There are many more details here which I find fascinating, but I'll link them in the description. And again, ask, what does this have to do with consciousness?
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are 98.7% identical to simians, right?
Right.
And there's only 1.3% differentiation, who's more evolved? We're consider ourselves to be more evolved. But you look at the simians, they have 48 chromosomes. We only have 46. Where did that change occur? Where did we get this new understanding? And how did we lose two chromosomes?
Oh my God, this hurts. Again, the number of genes or chromosomes you have doesn't speak to how evolved you are. And in this case, we didn't lose 2 chromosomes. Chimps and gorillas do have 24 pairs or 48 chromosomes. Humans do have 46 or 23 pairs of chromosomes. But we know that this comes from what is called a fusion event in our evolutionary history. Our chromosome number 2 is a fusion of chimp chromosomes number 2 and 3. Chromosome number 2 in humans contains all of the genes that are on chromosome 3 in these chimps and gorillas. You can actually see that the telomeres, which would have been on the ends of the chimp and gorilla chromosomes, are seen in the middle of our chromosome number 2, exactly where we would expect them if they had just fused together. And this is another thing that's actually really frustrating about listening to people like Terrence Howard and Joe Rogan. Through their belief system, they reject science and actually miss out on a lot of really amazing and cool answers that science has given us over the years. And I think it's really sad that people miss out on those amazing discoveries, and not just the ones that are just cool and help us understand our universe better, but also the ones that make our lives better and produce technologies and medicines that we can use to make everyday life way better than it was for us in the past. And that's why I do this YouTube channel, because I actually used to think like these guys. Seriously, when I was a teenager, I wholeheartedly believed a lot of conspiracy theories. I totally believed that sacred geometry had already solved all of our problems, and that the big they were just not wanting to listen or actively suppressing it, or were just plain evil. But I kept being earnestly curious, asking questions, and learning more about how science is actually done. And through that process, over a long period of time, I realized that those beliefs I had were just beliefs. They didn't actually stand up to scientific scrutiny. And don't get me wrong, it's not bad to have beliefs that are not supported by science. That's totally fine. It just becomes a problem when you entrench yourself so deep in beliefs that you start to reject reality and what science can establish. That's when beliefs become harmful. And these beliefs that Joe and Terrence are talking about, they are harmful. The truth is, we don't have all the answers in science. And that's exciting. There's still a lot of wonder, a lot of mystery, and a lot of amazing things to think about, to test, and discover in science. You don't need to substitute all of this fluff and pre-birth dreams to have your mind blown by the nature of reality. In fact, if you ask me, it's pretty boring to have a belief system like the one Terrence has, where he has everything figured out. Because when you have a system like his, you reject all of science and you replace it with your own things. Because instead of making the journey about what new things to question or test or discover in the natural world, it's more about just making everybody else accept and acknowledge that you already have everything figured out, and fighting the big they who want to keep you silenced. And of course, along the way, in order to fight the big they, people like Terrence have to recruit other people to their camp, which rejects science and medicine and instead takes expensive detox supplements every time their phone tells them to. And living in this world where you and your friends have it all figured out and everybody except you is just not woken up yet or straight up evil, that's a real scam. I have been Dr. Wilson. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. All the links to all the science I talk about are in the description below. And of course, if you enjoyed this, then don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.